Welcome back to the show, everybody. Our guest this evening is the host of the Liberty Weekly podcast, which you can find at libertyweekly.net. He's also an attorney and researcher, taking deep dives on libertarian topics, and also the Justin Raimondo Fellow at the Libertarian Institute. How about you get a few more things for me to read? Jesus, man. Patrick MacFarlane, welcome back to the show.
Hey, Alan, thanks for having me back on.
Patrick, you've been on a couple times, and I think every time you've been on, we had some predetermined topics to discuss, but I know something that you write about a lot and you're passionate about is foreign policy, and particularly relations with China. And we've never really had time to dive into that. And we're probably still not going to talk about alleged Uyghur genocide today either. I'm sorry to tell you that. But everybody's talking in the news about our wonderful Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, making a trip to Taiwan. So we're going to start there. What do you make, broad strokes, what do you make about Speaker Pelosi's trip to Taiwan?
Well, I think it's incredibly dangerous, and I think it marks the Biden administration. It's a administrational policy towards China, moving away from this idea of strategic ambiguity and the one China policy that has really been the bare bones of the foundation of U.S.-China policy since 1979, when the United States really began a rapprochement with China. At that time, it was an effort to kind of pry China away from Russia in kind of maybe what could have been a reunification after the Sino-Soviet split in, I believe, the 50s and 60s.
Now, I know a lot has been made of official remarks from Chinese officials in regards to Pelosi's trip to Taiwan, promising repercussions, saying that there would be consequences for her actions, strongly suggesting she should not visit the state. Do you think that that's mostly just hot air and political posturing, or do you think that this is a genuine existential threat?
I think it's a fair mix of both because, of course, you have China always saying extreme things. Usually what their rhetoric ramps up when the United States sends diplomatic envoys to Taiwan. Now, it's unofficial, but the United States, on paper, has an unofficial diplomatic relationship with Taiwan, but officially they have no diplomatic relationship with Taiwan. But throughout the years, they have been doing de facto diplomacy with Taiwan. So when the United States does things specifically to recognize or to legitimize the sovereignty of Taiwan as an independent country, that is when China gets the most upset. And that is when we see the most drastic responses, actual kinetic military responses. Now, when I say kinetic, I mean they launch missiles across the strait that land close to Taiwan, or they'll conduct, increasingly invasive patrols through the area, or they will fly warplanes in the Taiwanese air defense identification zone, which is not the same as legal airspace. One thing that you might see all over the place in right-wing media is, oh, China flew, 23 planes in Taiwan's airspace, while what they're referring to is the air defense identification zone, which actually is a huge arbitrary line that overlaps mainland China to a large degree. And so technically, the PLA could have airplanes on the runway in Fujian province, which is the Chinese province directly across from Taiwan, and they would technically be violating the ADIZ because it's an arbitrary designation. So there's a whole lot to unpack there, Alan.
Now, kind of looking at sort of the domestic political angle here, Nancy Pelosi has been a chief leader of the Democratic Party for decades. And if you were to read any recent political news here in the States, you would think that there was a battle of an existential circumstances between the right-wing and left-wing politics in the United States. And yet, you have GOP leaders cheering on Pelosi's trip to Taiwan, saying that it's a great thing, saying that they support her actions despite what official Biden administration talking points might be about Taiwan's relationship with the United States. How does that come to be? Does it amaze you that China is what is the topic that can bring right-wing and left-wing political leaders together?
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me at all. I mean, like I said, the pivot to Asia happened under Obama, and the United States kind of gearing up a new Cold War with China and Russia, but specifically with China, has been a bipartisan foreign policy consensus that really began under Obama. It kind of stagnated for a few years, was picked up in earnest under Trump, and then Biden has just increased a lot of Trump's policies, which is I've mentioned a lot before on my shows, but surrounding China with military bases, creating military alliance with China's neighbors, having other European countries and other countries in theater conduct joint military operations with the United States, sailing warships through the Taiwan Strait at the rate of about once per month for the last couple years, training Taiwanese military, doing all these escalatory measures really to increase tension on China, accusing China of genocide on the world stage, which is something that we mentioned earlier but won't get to today. And I wanted to add something to an earlier point because you asked, is this really dangerous, or is China just saying things to bluster and puff out its chest? And I said it's kind of a mix of the two, but I don't want to diminish the actual alarm and point of crises that we're at right now, because we are at a point of crisis in the Taiwan Strait. This is the fourth time that this has occurred. The first crisis happened in early 1950s when you had the Korean War going on in the United States, recognizing the authority, the sovereignty of Taiwan at that time, because this goes all the way back to 1949 when Chiang Kai-shek and had lost to the communists in the mainland China and fled to the island of Taiwan and ruled that country. Well, at the time, the United States recognized Taiwan as being a country. My stance is that the United States has no position on whether or not Taiwan is a country. I'm sure we'll address that a little bit later. But so the first crisis happened in the 50s. The United States presented the president at the time, whose name escapes me, Eisenhower, with options for military strikes inside China, but he declined that. Then in the 1950s, a few years later, you had another major crisis with, I think, China moving on certain islands surrounding Taiwan. Well, that stagnated for a while, but the third crisis happened in the 1990s when the then president of Taiwan, Lee Teng-hui, was issued a visa to speak at his alma mater in the United States at Cornell University, and he was received by U.S. Congressmen there. He gave the speech where he talked about Taiwan being a thriving democracy and kind of hinted at Taiwanese independence, and that majorly really irritated and aggravated China. So they started conducting these rocket firing exercises where they would shoot surface-to-surface missiles at Taiwan, which landed closer and closer to Taiwan over the span of 4 to 5 months. And the United States responded by sailing 2 aircraft carriers through the Strait of Taiwan. And there was a bunch of brinksmanship between the United States and China when finally it had been going on between 1995 to 1996. And they had kind of a rapprochement and thankfully were able to de-escalate tensions in the area. But over that time, China deployed 150,000 of their soldiers to Fujian across the strait from Taiwan. And we're seeing an escalation picking up right where 1996 left off. China has actually, in response to Nancy Pelosi coming to Taiwan, has began military drills in the waters around Taiwan, sometimes encroaching on Taiwan's actual their legal waters. I think I don't know if that's 10 or 20 miles off of the coast, but this is a huge escalation and a new low, maybe the lowest point in U.S.-China relations in modern history, and it's incredibly dangerous. So thanks for indulging me there, Alan.
Oh, no problem. Well, something that came to mind there is how complicated or more complex is the issue when you look at things from a global economic standpoint? When you look at economic trade, when you look at the massive amount of products that are being imported to the United States that are made overseas, particularly in the East, particularly in places like China. Of course, the United States exports stuff too, mostly debt. but that relationship economically exists. And obviously, it only stands to reason that it would be hurt when diplomatic or political relationship between the countries degrades. Do you see that playing a major part of tensions going into the future? Can economics save this, or are we reaching a point where a decoupling has to happen?
Well, that's one of the reasons why I oppose the populist right so strongly, because although they don't openly call for war with China, almost nobody is openly calling for war with China. But that's one thing that they'll tell you is, oh, no one's advocating for war with China. We just want to completely decouple from them economically. And the United States and China are two, each country respectively is one of the biggest trading partners of the other country. So we depend on China immensely for lots of our cheap consumer goods that raise our standard of living by providing products at cheap prices for regular people to consume. And one thing that Dave DeCamp really notified me of when I started talking to him about this topic, and he really alarmed me about it a few years ago, was that this economic decoupling probably has to happen before any major war between the United States and China could conceivably take place. And of course, that's because we rely on each other so heavily for staple items. And I had Joseph Solis Mullen on my show a couple weeks ago, and we were talking about this, and he pointed out just exactly how dependent China itself is on imports for staple goods, because China itself, I think he said on my show, don't quote me, look this up, but that China has less successful agricultural land per square mile than Saudi Arabia does. So it would stand to reason then that if they import a lot of their staple food items, the United States or the collective West blockading China or putting harsh sanctions on them, a la what we've seen in Russia, actually wouldn't. It would hurt them a lot more than it has Russia. And with Russia, we've seen it backfire a lot. So I think it stands to reason that the economic part connecting the economic relations connecting the United States with China is a huge barrier to conflict, but we see a lot of hawks trying to eliminate that linkage and get the United States more, dependent on other countries for our staple items, because certainly the regulations in our country and the lockdowns have kneecapped us from being able to support ourselves on that front.
Now, I'm going to play devil's advocate here with you, Patrick, a little bit, because you mentioned sort of opposing the populist right wing and the nationalists who would perhaps maybe a short way to put it is that what they're advocating would set the stage for future more serious disagreements between the two countries. I want to read for you a few different positions that are very commonly heard and get your perspective. The first one is, and this is for our libertarian audience out there specifically, the Chinese Communist Party is evil, Patrick. They're just awful. And supporting Taiwanese self-determination and independence is the libertarian position. What do you say to that?
Well, when I hear this, I think a lot about Jeff Deist and speeches that he gave when I was a very new libertarian, talking about being against libertarian universalism, because and that is to say that we only have it's that liberation is not the goal, self-determination is the goal. And as someone sitting in the United States, of course I have sympathy for people who want freedom and liberty all across the globe. But what is my role as a Roman living in the Roman Empire? What is my goal in assisting them in that pursuit? And I have no role to play in that as a member of the United States. And a lot of this is, well, do you live in Ancapistan in your head? I mean, to borrow a talking point from some libertarian detractors. But I think it's apt here, because we don't live in a vacuum. We live in a world where the United States is the global hegemon. And when the United States says we want to bring freedom and democracy, first off, well, we don't have freedom and democracy that we really can bring to other nations. We've destroyed that at home. But you can't spread freedom and democracy at the barrel of the gun. You can't do it by instigating these regime change operations that leave countries in complete turmoil with failed states, and we have plenty of examples of those in Iraq being one and Libya being another one, and there's the laundry list just goes on and on. So we don't have the ability to liberate these people. We don't have the freedom to give to them, and everything that we do just makes things a whole lot worse. So I wish these people well. I mean, I wouldn't even airdrop copies of For a New Liberty in these countries. The United States has no part in this to play, no part that's good, and we should just mind our own business and let freedom organically develop. And moreover, people in these countries might not want freedom, and I'm not one to impose freedom on these people.
By the way, around here we call those LEOs, Liberty Enforcement Officers.
Yeah.
It's the Liberty Enforcement Officers are the ones who are going to enforce. I mean, if you break it down, they're just enforcing their worldview upon others with nary a care in the world about the political pendulum swinging the other way and those guns being pointed right back at them. I do want to point out really quick before we move on to the next devil's advocate point that when you read a phrase like supporting Taiwanese self-determination, the real crux of the argument is define the word supporting, right? What do you mean by supporting? I mean, I support everyone's self-determination and independence so much as I want it for them. But I think Patrick, you make an interesting point that when you're a Roman citizen in the Roman Empire, do we have the liberty to give other people? As you know, is that a consumer good that we can export? You would say no.
Right, it's not. It's not something that we can export. I mean, especially at the point of a gun. But like I said, if we're in the situation where we are trying to impose liberty, or we're trying to instigate some kind of coup in a certain country, it's like artificially messing with the market. You know, we know that as libertarians, and I guess this is a really libertarian specific argument, but we know that there is a natural order that comes about when you leave people organically decentralized fashion to create to transact with each other consensually. And when you mess with that, you have unintended consequences. And that's exactly what happens when we mess with the governments of other countries. And moreover, the people in those countries don't get a say about the matter. And I wanted to point out that when people say that when we are supporting liberty and democracy in Taiwan, well, that's not always the case, because the Republic of China government, I believe they had martial law for a long stretch of time from 1949 until the 80s. And so it's clearly not about supporting liberty and democracy as much as it is just encircling China.
I'm gonna hit you with another one here, Patrick. Somebody is going to dominate the globe. It's just the way of the world. So if someone's going to do it, it might as well be the United States. American hegemony is good for the world. Do you agree with that statement?
No, absolutely I don't. But I struggle to understand exactly. It's like Tim Pool talks about this all the time, which is somewhat
Uh-oh.
I've criticized.
Here we go.
But I think it's a fair point to make. It's like, we're all in a movie theater and we're all watching one screen, but half of the people in the movie theater are watching one film and the other half are watching a different film, even though they're watching the same screen. So I just don't know. There's never really any evidence really to support this argument that the United States, because what's the alternative? Well, we have no idea what the alternative is, because the United States has been the world hegemon for the last 60, ever since World War II. And we have nothing to compare it to. What we do have are concrete examples of the United States, risking world annihilation by competing with other nuclear powers, starting proxy wars on their doorstep that have the risk of obliterating all life on this planet. Not to mention all the regime change operations where the United States has killed people with impunity, imposed sanctions on countries that don't fall in order, killing hundreds of thousands of civilians. And that's just the reality of it. So I don't know. I guess you could say, well, things would be a lot worse if we just had a different policy. So therefore, we have to keep trying this policy. I think it's just a fallacious argument that's supported by just anecdotes, assertions.
Speaking of that, I know you and I are both Ron Paul guys, and something that we discussed just the other day was that the non-interventionism was a key component of the Ron Paul revolution. Is understanding the difference between isolationism and non-interventionism. Uh, Really, just being anti-war, anti-war as a central plank of whatever policy you might be building. But there are people who say this: non-interventionism doesn't work. Why doesn't it work? Because appeasement and validation of dictators doesn't make for a peaceful world. Patrick, you got to have an iron fist with these monsters. Do you agree with that?
Well, that is often said to as like, I don't know, it's used as a whip. That statement is used as a whip to say that our current leaders are not being tough enough, because one thing Tim Pool says a lot specifically is that, well, Russia and China never would have moved on Ukraine and Taiwan if Donald Trump were president, because Trump told Xi and Putin that if you move on Ukraine and Taiwan respectively, I'm going to nuke Moscow and Beijing, and that's just what's going to happen. So they're always using this rhetoric to say that our leaders are too weak, and that's the problem. We need to be more hawkish and more aggressive, and then these problems wouldn't happen. When instead, I think that objectively, if you look at these administrations, you see that particularly Trump and Biden have been extremely aggressive towards Russia and China. I mean, Trump left nuclear arms control treaties with Russia. He sent these these shoulder fired rockets to Ukraine in use against the Russian military, when even Obama wouldn't do that. He had new bases in Poland, ramping up all these exercises in the Black Sea, in Eastern Europe with NATO, simulating nuclear strikes on Moscow. I don't know if Biden did that, but there's all these examples, of ways that Trump and Biden have been incredibly hawkish towards Russia and China. And that talking point that, oh, well, we can't just appease dictators. Well, we haven't even tried appeasing dictators. What we've been doing is being as hawkish as you would like to be. That's what's objectively is happening. So I just think that's a garbage argument.
Well, I know an easy analogy to make that I've seen going around the internet is that whenever, particularly as it relates to China and Taiwan, is that at the end of the day, China is pursuing its own quote unquote vital interests in the South China Sea. And while you and I might not agree with China or the methods in which it pursues its quote unquote vital interests, the fact of the matter is that they're doing it, and they're doing it in the South China Sea. And how is that any different than, say, the United States pursuing its vital interests in the Gulf of Mexico, or turning an eye to Cuba? What I know these analogies have been made before, but what would the United States think if Russia was building military bases, just south of the Rio Grande? What would the United States think if China was sailing aircraft carriers into the Gulf of Mexico because they were concerned about, democracy in Cuba? What would the United States think about that?
Well, here's where you're wrong, Alan. You're wrong.
Uh-oh.
You're wrong, because the United States is special. We are ordained by God that our people are here to provide liberty and democracy to the globe. And that's the way it is. So we can't turn the tables, Alan, and think about how we would feel if other countries did what we're doing, because they're not special. We are exceptional. We are the exceptional nation. That is the United States. And the world oceans are our lakes. And all we need to do is, keep peace and order, make sure those trade routes are open, and completely obliterate anyone who might want to have their own region of influence in their near abroad.
One last little point here, Patrick, before we wrap up, is I know there's been a lot of talk about how the U.S. Armed Forces are scrambling a bit right now because recruitment's down. They're not able to meet their recruitment goals, I think, across any of the major branches of the military, and they're discussing ways that we got to pump up those numbers. Is Do you sort of see that kind of like the invisible hand of the market making itself known, that if the US military is unable to recruit at the levels that they would like, that's sort of a way of young potential military recruits telling the US empire, we don't want to be a part of this.
Yeah, I hope so. And I think I wrote a little piece on this talking about the Battle of the Somme in World War One. And for those of you who aren't familiar with it, the Battle of the Somme was one of the largest battles of all time. The British, on the first day of the battle, lost almost, I think it was 20,000 soldiers, 10 or 20,000 soldiers in the bloodiest day. I think over the course of the battle, it lasted maybe like 6 months, that the British ended up losing like 80,000 soldiers to casualties and KIAs. And my whole point was, how would the United States react today if there was a battle with similar casualties? And I think one of my main points was that I think, judging by the COVID reaction, I think that society would grind to a halt, that we would just cease to function because we're so soft nowadays. And I think that's kind of a beautiful thing in a way, because the United States as a nation, we're so casualty adverse, and we've never really had to face real casualties since the Vietnam War. But even then, they weren't as large as some conflicts like World War II and World War One. And if that were to happen today, I just don't know how society would react if we had one Battle of the Somme. If the United States gets in some kind of military kinetic engagement with the PLA around Taiwan, if we lose one aircraft carrier, that's 3,000 soldiers, 3,000 seamen, rather, sailors that we would lose in the span of a couple hours. That's more than we lost on 9/11. So the stakes here are incredibly high for the United States. I mean, not to mention the risk of nuclear war or some kind of real prolonged conflict with China. And so I really, I hope that this trend continues, but it'd be interesting to see how the military addresses it in terms of, will they reinstitute a draft? And now we have
Yes.
freedom and equality of having women and men qualify for the draft. Unless I'm mistaken. Am I right about that, Alan, that women have to register?
I think that did ultimately pass. I think with roaring approval from our left wing friends, because goodness knows we all have to be enslaved and sent into the trenches equally. Um, you know, in a weird collapsitarian sort of way, Patrick, I love legislation like that because I think that there's a lot more people waking up. A lot of your middle America type people who were perfectly content to tie the ribbons on their trees and perfectly content to always say, well, I might not agree with the government, but I'm going to support the troops. A lot of those people are suddenly saying, you're not having my daughter.
Yeah.
And you know what? If that's what it took to get you to bow your back to these people, then I'm glad it happened. But I want to say this, and I'm going to let you have the final word. If history teaches us anything, is that in these imperialist ambitions, these globe-trotting empires don't last. And I know that folks like you and I might say that, look, the American empire is going to collapse. And I've always thought it won't collapse because of external enemies. It'll collapse under the weight of its own debt and hubris. That's what'll happen. And if China tries to fill that void, it'll happen to them too. But I think what's way more important for true liberty-minded folks who are truly anti-war to understand is we want to minimize and negate any potential wide-ranging worldwide conflicts that could lead superpowers into war. Because if we truly believe that empires will collapse on their own, then we want there to be a world left over for the people to enjoy when those empires are done globetrotting.
Yeah, and I mean there's a whole lot to that. But I don't believe that personally. I don't believe that China has the ability to become a world empire. With the way that their economy is set up, and I'll refer again to my episode that I just did with Joseph Solis Mullen to talk about the sheer economics of it. But David Stockman is someone we all appreciate and respect, and he's been calling China the Red Ponzi for decades. And I think it's just a matter of time. But I don't honestly believe that China has the ability to really be a world empire. I think they will struggle, honestly, to have hegemony over their near abroad even. And so I don't understand why we can't have normal relations with these countries, why Russia and China can't be welcome to the world stage, why we can't be happy about two nations who have rising standards of living for their people and enough power on the world stage to really, maybe we could bring in, if we just got along, maybe we could bring in some kind of economic golden age for the earth. And I think that the powers that shouldn't be probably have some alternative plan, because one thing I don't cover a whole lot, but I always like to say exists, is the fact that we're looking at the 2D chessboard, to use the analogy, but there is powers in this world that transcend national borders and moneyed financial interests that are behind both sides of this conflict, just like every conflict in the history of mankind. So it's interesting to see how those things interplay. And in terms of what the end game is, we can only speculate. But I do fear that there is that part of that end game involves a real conflict between the United States and China and Russia, and the broader West as well. And so to end and touch on the point that we're at now, right? I mentioned before the Taiwan Relations Act in 1979 really outlined what's been called strategic ambiguity, and that right now the United States' reputation for not sticking with that strategic ambiguity, at least saying that they're adhering to those principles, our credibility is thrown out the window, because our lips say one thing and our actions do another one. And our actions have said that we will support Taiwan and we will intervene in the event of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. And Pelosi going to the island has completely destroyed any credibility that we have with China. Even Biden thought it was not a good idea. The Pentagon thought it was a good idea, but I think they tacitly approved of the trip because they did absolutely nothing to stop it. So now we have a crisis, the fourth Taiwan Strait crisis going on. The PLA is doing all these military drills surrounding the island of Taiwan. I think that sanctions and a total blockade of the island will follow. And this crisis could last for months, just like the third Taiwan crisis did in the 90s. And so this morning, Nancy Pelosi left Taiwan. She left Taiwan in the lurch, where now she kicked off a huge firestorm. Now she's leaving. See ya. Peace. Don't give a shit about you. And so that's the situation that we're at. And it doesn't look very good, Alan.
Boy, I wonder if Pelosi cares as much about her constituents in San Francisco as she does about the Taiwanese people.
Yeah, right. Well, the truth is, she doesn't give a shit about either of them.
Okay. Well, Patrick, we're out of time.
Yeah.
I promise someday we will talk about all the poor Uyghurs being genocided.
Oh, man. Do you want people to hate you? Hate me?
You say, do I want, as if it's not a current frame of existence. Patrick, where can people go to support you and hear more about these topics?
Yeah, well, you can go to my membership website at libertyweekly.club, where I have a newsletter where I send out preprints of my articles and bonus content there. Otherwise, you can catch my articles at the Libertarian Institute and antiwar.com. They're usually rerun at antiwar.com. So that's where you can find me. libertyweekly.club, libertyweekly.net.
Patrick, we're going to get you out of here on this one. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Is a waffle a cake?
Is a waffle a cake? No. Is that the right answer?
Oh, no, Patrick. Unfortunately, a waffle is simply a cake. Patrick, we've got to shame our friends and brothers who eat cake for breakfast. Pancakes and waffles are both cakes.
They are cakes, huh? They call it a Belgian waffle. Is that because it has, like, I don't know, they put some kind of oil in it to make it poof up? Is that the definition of a cake?
But it sounds like some fucking commie gobbledygook.